To my left, Angelo Hart is Youth for Social Justice leader and represents the Youth for Social Justice on the MSJ executive. So good morning. Thanks for members of the media for coming out on not our normal media conference day for the MSJ on a Friday, but we appreciate you coming out, and we call this on Friday because of the tremendous discussion and debate and anxiety that have been experienced in Trinidad and Tobago as a result of Tuesday's major earthquake, which happened at about 5:31 in the afternoon. I myself experienced it. I was in my car, stationary, my car was parked and so on when it hit, and so I felt it and so on. And then on Tuesday morning, just about 9:27, 28, I just pulled up here in the car park here and was talking with a colleague from the Highway Route Movement from Debe, and she was relating to me her situation, and I said, "You're feeling another one." So I also felt the one on Wednesday morning. So let me first, on behalf of the MSJ, express our solidarity and our concern with all of those who may have had damage to their homes or to their business places as a result of the earthquake on Tuesday in particular, to the religious organizations, the Anglican Church and to the Roman Catholic Church for the damages done to the Holy Trinity Cathedral and the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, respectively, two iconic buildings in Port of Spain, as well, of course, the centers of those two Christian denominations in our country. And let me also express our solidarity with the farmers of Los Zero who have been badly affected by the damaged road, and therefore the difficulties which they're going to have to access their agricultural crops and so on. And to citizens generally, people generally, who experience a certain amount of trauma and are still feeling a sense of anxiety as a result of the earthquake. It was not a pleasant experience at all, and for some it was more harrowing than others, particularly those maybe who have been working in high-rise buildings and so on. It would have been particularly nerve-wracking, having regard to the fact that they would have had to exit many flights of stairs and so on, and not being sure if they would make it out of the building alive and in one piece. So it has been, in a sense, a real wake-up call for us in Trinidad and Tobago to address the issue of disasters, natural disasters. The seismologists have been warning us for quite a number of years that, quite apart from Trinidad being in an earthquake zone, we are also in a situation where we are due to have a very severe earthquake, which would cause horrendous damage and destruction and possible significant loss of life, and therefore we have to be properly prepared for that event. It's not good enough to say, well, we haven't had it yet, so it's not likely to happen. The longer we have not had it, the greater the probability of such a severe earthquake taking place. That is what the experts, the scientists, have been warning us, and we have not really responded as a country to those warnings. We also have, of course, the natural disasters as a result of heavy rainfalls and storm-type weather. And just last week, we had, of course, severe flooding in various parts of the country, in Port of Spain area, in Bethlehem and elsewhere in particular. And we know that we are prone to damage by floods and landslides as a result of heavy rainfall, weather conditions which have been aggravated by climate change, which we know is a reality in the world. And we have done very little in terms of addressing the threats of climate change impacts, as well as the natural occurring and regularly occurring heavy rainfalls and possible storms that we can experience. And because we have been fiddling while Rome is burning, to use a famous saying, our country's leadership has failed signally. And this leadership, of course, is not only the current leadership, but past leaderships. And therefore, and it is really the government's responsibility to take the lead in ensuring that our country is prepared as best as we can for natural disasters. And our country's leaderships, be they UNC or PNM, have failed this country signally. Total failure. And I want to quote a Japanese proverb, which I came across actually just quite coincidentally a few days ago. And the proverb says, "Vision without action is a daydream, but action without a vision is a nightmare. Action without a vision is a nightmare." And Trinidad and Tobago is going through a nightmare because we have had certain kinds of actions without a coherent vision. So you get a bit of flooding, and the party in opposition cusses out the government, and then they get a contractor, pay millions of dollars, get some backhoes, and they clean up some water courses. And following year, the same thing happens again. Then you have a change of government, and you may get a different contractor, the same contractor doing the same work, and we're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get a different result. And of course, that is an indication of madness at the level of leadership. And so we don't have any plan to really address flooding, except after the event, and then people go in to clean up or to give out hampers and mattresses and stuff like that. And this happens over and over again, in many cases to the same communities, sometimes different communities, but we do the same thing over and over and over again. And we are going to have worse events as time goes on because of climate change and our lack of proper preparedness. And in the case of earthquakes, we could have been affected much worse had that earthquake not been so deep. Had it been at a shallower level and somewhat closer to Trinidad and Tobago, the devastation would have been unimaginable in this country. Action without a vision is a nightmare. And the MSJ has proposed before, and I'm going to reiterate it now, that we should have a national reconstruction plan, a national reconstruction effort, not simply a plan, national reconstruction effort. I put this forward as part of our budget, post-budget discussion last year, October, so it was almost a year ago that we put forward this idea, and reiterated it on a number of occasions, and so I'm going to repeat it now, that what this country needs in the face of our economic difficulties, of people being unemployed, facing the threat of natural disasters, climate change and so on, and also the problems of Petrotrin's asset integrity and the need for us to restore Petrotrin to viability, we should have a national reconstruction effort which would involve all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to ensure that we can get through natural disasters and the impact of climate change with the minimal possible negative impacts to physical resources and, of course, with respect to minimal impacts with respect to loss of life and property and so on. What is this national reconstruction effort that we are proposing? That we need to mobilize the excess liquidity in the financial sector. We just had the National Investment Fund, and as I had indicated some time before, we would have liked to see that as a mutual fund rather than as a bond issue. But notwithstanding that, that was oversubscribed by 50%, by more than $2 billion. And as of May 2018, the central bank data showed that there was well over $2 billion that banks had in cash, excess cash lying around in the financial sector. That was just the commercial banks, not talking about insurance companies, pension funds, and so on, and as well as credit unions. So we have a significant amount of cash available in the country. In other words, the economy, even with all the difficulties, is still generating financial resources which are idle, which are not being put to use. At the same time that we have many young people who are unemployed. We have university graduates coming out with engineering degrees, with other degrees in occupational safety and health, environmental management, in the social sciences and so on. And all of these young people could be mobilized in this national reconstruction effort. Then we have young people who are unemployed and not so young people who have skills, masonry, carpentry, welding, fabricating, and so on, construction skills, which could be used in this national reconstruction program and effort. And there are other young people who don't have skills, but who can be quickly trained up to be involved in such an effort. And we are proposing that we mobilize these financial resources and the people resources. And I should also mention in terms of the financial resources that in the commercial banks, there is more than 20 billion TT dollars, which is in excess of 3 billion US dollars in deposits in the commercial banks, which are just idle. So there is a lot of US cash in our banking system, and this does not include money which Trinidad and Tobago nationals have been banking abroad through capital flight in banks in Miami or Panama, Cayman Islands, London, wherever they're putting their money. And therefore, if we have this national effort that brings together the whole country and the professional engineers, university lecturers and technical people and so on, we can then engage in public infrastructure works, drainage and other infrastructure works to improve our communities, to ensure that houses don't slip down and get cracked and so on, that are built on the hillsides of the northern range in communities that have been there for 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 years, along the foothills of the northern range from Carenage to Arima and so on. We can ensure those communities have better community facilities, ensure that they are not going to be impacted by heavy rainfall and climate change or by earthquakes and so on. And we can also ensure that flood-prone areas are addressed in this national reconstruction effort. And also to deal with asset integrity, pipelines, tanks, platforms, and so on that Petrotrin needs to have dealt with, and also begin to invest in exploration and production activities for Petrotrin. So we increase our output at the same time that we are generating employment and so on, and ensuring as much as possible that we have domestic inputs to this effort in terms of cement and other materials locally, and also addressing the issue of the steel mill, which could then be brought back into active production to generate the output that will be required for such a national reconstruction program. So that is what we are proposing, and this does not mean that we are not addressing issues of increased agriculture and food production and all those other things that are necessary in the economy, or housing and other needs. But what we are saying is that we could have a national reconstruction program where we are using all of our idle resources and organized in such a way that you don't give half a dozen big contractors the contracts to do all the work, so that the money goes into their pockets so that they become bigger billionaires than they already are, but rather that we ensure that smaller contractors, as well as the establishment of community cooperatives, so that the community cooperatives owned by people in the community, they will also engage in this work using their own skills and so on, not controlled by any particular individual who might be involved in illegal activity in the community, but really community-driven, owned cooperatives, which is what we call the social economy, which is another aspect of, therefore, changing the pattern of ownership and wealth in Trinidad and Tobago. So that is the skeleton of what we have proposed. It is not the first time we're proposing it, and we are therefore coming up with a big idea, a major vision, because only the MSJ has a major vision. The others are quibbling about all kinds of things, and so on, which are necessary in terms of whether buildings are structurally sound and whether buildings are properly insured. Those things are important, but those things are not going to resolve the fundamental problems of Trinidad and Tobago. And only the MSJ is offering a vision to resolve the fundamental problems of Trinidad and Tobago. Anything else, all the actions that will be taken without a vision is a nightmare, and whether it is Kamala under the UNC or Keith and the PNM, they have leadership that has no vision and therefore is only offering us nightmare going into the future. That's fine. No question is silly, radical.
But if you're talking about the money that is in banks and so on, right? Or that excess liquidity, right? How that money would be owed by people? They would have their money in the bank, right? How would that money be used then to do these infrastructural?
It would have to be done. And that's an excellent question. Excellent question, and I omitted to refer to that. So we're talking about the establishment of a National Reconstruction Fund, which will be funded through things like bond issues, so that people will get a return on their investment through the bond, just which rate of return would be better than, say, putting it in a fixed deposit in the bank and getting 3% interest, so that it would be a good, safe investment. And we are proposing that this National Development Fund, if you wish, be not part of government's recurrent expenditure. So this is not to be managed by the Minister of Finance. It's not a government thing in that sense. It has to be initiated by the government, but involving citizens, the private sector, and everybody. So everybody feels a sense of ownership of the thing. Because people putting money in order to get a benefit later down, not only a financial benefit, but a better country, and a better life, and a better community, and a safer and more sustainable development in the country. And so rather than have to spend money after the event, we are talking about the old proverb, a stitch in time saves nine. Yes? So we're investing now to ensure that we can save money rather than having later on a huge disaster and then we don't have the resources to rebuild after that huge disaster. If we could minimize the impact of a disaster by this national reconstruction effort, you will never totally eliminate damage from a huge disaster, but we could certainly reduce the risk by this effort. And so we're talking about a National Development Fund, which would then be managed in the same way that the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is managed, yes, by an independent body, legally established and so on, with persons representing major stakeholders and so on, but independently managed from Minister of Finance, so it cannot be politicized in any way. That's what we're proposing.
So is it a savings to help in the event of a disaster or to put things in place in case of a disaster?
This is to help put things in place to try to prevent damage and loss that a disaster would generate. In other words, if we had that earthquake at 30 kilometers beneath the surface on Tuesday, maybe 30 or 40% of the buildings or more in Trinidad and Tobago would be either significantly damaged or completely destroyed, because they're not built to withstand an earthquake of that magnitude. Yes? Now, if we therefore have a national reconstruction program, then we can retrofit buildings to ensure that they could withstand all but the most extreme earthquakes. Yes? And therefore, that's why we're saying it's a stitch in time to save nine. And if we spend, for example, just for argument's sake, you spend $100 million to address 200 buildings, that is better than having to see those 200 buildings completely in rubble and then having to spend $2 billion to construct those 200, to build 200 new buildings. Yes?
So you're saying a fund where people can invest, right? And then you're targeting buildings with this proposed plan targeting houses. Because I mean, if I'm investing in a plan, I don't want to see the money just go to your retrofitting government buildings or to what businesses where you all can implement.
Yes.
Will it also be, will our homes also get some kind of...
That is a possibility, but then if you get money out of it, then you would have to pay something. It's like a loan, so you would have to also pay back to get that retrofitted, your private home retrofitted. Now, a business can afford to do it because they would then factor that into their depreciation accounts. Yes, because businesses are supposed to allocate X amount of money out of their revenue flow for depreciation, which is not an actual expenditure, it's a cash thing. But if they allocate money out of their depreciation or put money from their depreciation allocation to pay back a loan to the National Development Fund. It means, therefore, that by paying back that loan, which would be relatively low interest, that loan would then enable the persons who bought the bonds to get their bonds repaid with interest and so on. So I'm putting forward a skeleton proposal, and this is something that we will be talking to financial, construction, other experts and so on to be able to begin to quantify it. And we'll be working on this over the next few weeks and few months. But I'm putting out the idea now. We did it before and I didn't quantify it, but we will have to work to quantify it. But we're putting back the idea given what happened on Tuesday. Yeah? Yes. Right, and so the National Building Code has to be passed into legislation urgently. That should be number one on the government's legislative agenda. And there ought to be no politicking about it, yes? And so that ought to be number one on the government's legislative agenda. And the business community, in terms of contractors, need to be on board, architects, and so on need to be on board. There needs to be proper education about it, and so on and so on. And all of the institutions, banks need to ensure that when they approve a loan for somebody to build a house or a commercial building or whatever, that the plans are up to and have been certified as meeting the building code. Town and Country has to do the same. If EMA approval has to be given for a project, all of the agencies, the regional corporations, WASA, everybody has to be on board. Fire service and so on has to be on board on those things. And we have to ensure that illegal construction is not taking place, because people are putting up buildings. And it's not just squatters, People talk about squatters. There are a lot of business people and homeowners who put up structures. Sometimes business people put up 3- and 4-story buildings without proper approvals, and we don't know whether they're meeting the standards. So everybody now has to be, if you are shaken up, as you were, it now has to shake you up to the point of saying, I have to recognize that I have a personal responsibility to comply with approvals and meeting standards, etc. So it's not just government. It has to be everybody taking responsibility. Sorry. Well, I don't know. Given that there are no building codes, there's no penalty at the moment. So we'll have to see what is there. But yes, you need to, particularly things like commercial buildings where the public goes in, or where people work. You've seen the reports in the media over the years of buildings collapsing in places like Bangladesh and India and other places like that in some parts of Latin America and Mexico and so on, where buildings collapse or there's a fire and there was no proper exit, or exits were locked to keep workers inside, to keep them working, and not just one person died, but hundreds of people died horrifically. We cannot have that kind of behavior in this country. And therefore, yes, whatever is established, including the existing Occupational Safety and Health Act and so on, we must ensure that penalties for violations are significant enough, but they're also policed to ensure that there are no violations. Yes. 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 Well, I'm aware that there's been a lot of shoddy construction of HTC homes. I'm aware of that firsthand because a number of HTC homeowners have come to me to get my assistance to be relocated. And I've been working on that. In some cases, they've been relocated. In some cases, relocation is still to take place. Where, for example, there have been land slips in Turuba, just here, threatening homes, where people in Edinburgh were living in buildings where when you switch on the lights, you got shocked because there's water, or when you turn on the shower, you got shocked because the electrical lines were running too close to the water lines, conduits and so on, where in Lions Gate, water continuously enters the apartments or the townhouses at the end facing the east, because as the rain blows, the water seems to seep through the wall or through the windows or something like that, or roofs are leaking. So I went into a home in Hubertstown. Do you know Hubertstown in Gonzales? Yes, going down to Point, where there were HEC houses built on behalf of the NEC, the National Energy Company, to relocate persons who lived in Square Deal, which is just south of Labray, when the smelter was being proposed and there was a buffer zone and they had to be removed and so on. And I went in some years ago, this must have been 2012 perhaps. Mr. Larry Hawaii was still the chairman of NGC and NEC. Mr. Andrew Jupiter was the CEO of NEC. And both of them met me because we were looking at the quality of homes for which people were to be relocated. And we went in on a Sunday morning, I think it was. And I went into one home. It was a flat home, quite small. And I said to them, I don't think that I was drinking last night, which I was saying that as a joke. I wasn't, obviously. But I was feeling giddy. I was, because the floor was sloped. I was sloped enough that you actually felt yourself leaning. And that contractor was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for that home. And then there were other homes in that same Hubertstown area built on stilts, which could not be occupied because there were huge cracks in the wall and in the columns. So I'm aware from my own physical observations that HEC has had over the years contractors that have not done work up to a proper standard. And therefore, HEC has to take responsibility to ensure that they have project managers, persons on the site who are making sure that what is constructed is proper. Yes? And all public buildings and private buildings ought to have that. I recall when I was chairman of Cipriani College, for example, there was at least one major problem, and the contractor had to rectify it. They had poured concrete, and then when we tested the concrete pour, there were it did not meet the standard, because we ensured that the project manager tested the concrete pour, and it was not up to standard. And we told the contractor, without going into detail, you have to dig out the entire amount. It was a huge amount of concrete that was poured, trust me. You have to dig it all out and re-pour at your cost. And that is what you have to do. You have to ensure that the standards are maintained by having people on site, and HEC probably lapses in some regard, and contractors cut costs or cut corners, and public money is being paid to them, and that is wrong. And you haven't said anything. That's it? Okay? So you like that quote? Vision without action is a daydream, and action without a vision is a nightmare. Yes.